Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. Today I'm going to talk to you about something near and dear to my heart, sports, in particular sports analytics. And hopefully by the end we'll have an answer to this question, how are baseball players like factories? And this is work that is derived from my research that I've done with a good friend of mine, Doug Fearing, who recently became head of analytics for the LA Dodgers. So first off, a quick question. What do you think of when you hear the phrase sports analytics? Shout it out. Moneyball. I swear I didn't pay her to say that because this is what's up first. Okay, so Moneyball, right? So Moneyball made sports analytics very popular, very mainstream, the book and then the movie. And even though we'd all probably want to be the good-looking general manager who gets to make the decisions and throw furniture without any repercussions when he's upset, right? More likely than not, if you're getting into this field, you are most likely going to be Jonah Hill, the guy crunching numbers in the background. Okay, so what is sports analytics? Well, as I alluded to, it's about number crunching, it's about statistics, it's about data. I'd like to offer a broader interpretation today. I'd like to think about sports analytics as not just statistics or advanced statistics or fancy stats, as it's referred to these days, but also models. In particular, I want to talk about mathematical models of decision-making, or decision models for short. And today, I'm going to give an illustration of how these types of decision models can give us new insight into a very old problem in baseball. Okay. So here's the motivation. So during a game between Tampa and Seattle, in May 2012, B.J. Upton, who is Tampa's center fielder, started to experience tightness in his leg. And as a precautionary measure, the team took him out of the game. They didn't want him to get injured. Okay? And so the following is a news story that was posted online following the game. And it read as follows. Upton's departure set into motion a radical change of positions in the field for the Rays. So he was here at center field, right? So he goes out of the game. And so what happened? Desmond Jennings shifted from left field to center. Matt Joyce went from right to left. Ben Zobrist moved from second to right. Elliot Johnson entered the game to play shortstop. Sean Rodriguez moved from shortstop to third, and Will Rhymes shifted from third to second. So a massive chain reaction happened on the field. What was the alternative? Maybe a bench player would have gone directly into center field. But why did Tampa think that this was the better decision? So to understand that, we need to look at this list of open questions. So Baseball Prospectus came up with this list in 2000 of 23 open questions in baseball analytics. And interestingly, they modeled this after a list of 23 open math problems that a famous mathematician, David Hilbert, came up with in 1900. And so what was one of these 23 open questions? So it was this topic of positional flexibility. So what does it say? It says a player who plays two positions at a league average level gives his manager flexibility, both in setting up the team's roster and using in-game strategies. Because roster spots are scarce, a team gets value from having a player, from a player's ability to play multiple positions, but we do not yet have an understanding of how much value there is to having such a player on our team. So intuitively, if I have two players, one who can only play one position, and another player who can play multiple positions, who would I rather have? All else being equal, I'd rather have the person who's more flexible. But the question is, how do we quantify this flexibility? What is that worth to my team? How many wins do I get by having this extra flexible player on my team? And so to understand this, we looked at another field rooted in industrial engineering, manufacturing. And this concept of flexibility has been very well studied in manufacturing, actually, for decades. And so here's the illustration. Let's pretend we have three factories, and each factory is producing one type of car. Let's say one factory burns down, and this type of car can no longer be produced anymore. So this would be an example of a production network with no flexibility. At the other end of the spectrum might be this graph. So we have three factories. Each can produce all types of cars, and each type of car can be produced at all three factories. So if one factory goes down, it can't produce anymore, but still all three types of cars can be produced, albeit perhaps at a lower level of production. Okay? And something in between might look like this. Every factory can produce two types of cars. Every type of car can be produced at two factories. Okay? So what's the connection between this and baseball? So as the title suggests, players are our factories. And what they're doing is they're not producing cars, but they're producing innings played at the various positions in the field, namely catcher, first base, second base, and so on. So how do we take this idea and build a model around it and use it to understand this flexibility idea? So here's the thought experiment that I'd like us all to undertake together. So let's pretend, first of all, that each player can only play a single position. Okay, so this player who can play first, second, third, and shortstop, let's pretend his primary position is first, and so now he can only play first base. And I do the same with all of the other players. I take away all of their secondary capabilities. I take away their flexibility, basically. So now everyone can only play one position. Now what happens when someone gets injured? Well, let's say this person gets injured. He can't play left field anymore, so the only option the team has is to substitute in a bench player, who presumably plays left field much worse. Okay? And then we compare this to the case when the players have their native flexibility. So we go back to this original picture. Same person gets injured, can't play left field or center anymore, right? But because these other players have flexibility, maybe this player swings over and covers left field. But this player used to play third base, so someone else has to swing over and play third base. And this chain reaction continues. So this is that connection between the manufacturing flexibility and the baseball flexibility. Okay? So for those of you who are interested, I just want one quick slide to talk about the scientific approach, the details behind the models. So what we do is we develop statistical models to estimate a few things. One, injury risk, and then if a player is injured, how long they're going to be injured for. And then another statistical model to estimate how good a player might be playing at an off position, not their primary position. Then we build a simulation model that uses the statistical models to then simulate, let's say over the course of an average season, how long players will be injured for. And as a result, we know how much time they have available over the course of the season. And then finally, the final decision model is an optimization model, where we take as input the available playing time that comes out of the simulation model, and then we optimize, or we basically assign what player is playing what position for what fraction of the season. Okay? And by doing this type of a comparison with and without flexibility, we can quantify a few things. So the first thing we quantify is the value of team flexibility. If we have a team of players who have their native flexibility versus the same team where we break all of their secondary capabilities, what's the delta? What's the difference in performance? And so that's the first thing we quantify here. So this is all of the MLB teams rank ordered in terms of their value of flexibility. So these are percentages. What does this percentage represent? These numbers represent the improvement in RAR. So RAR stands for runs above average, or you can think of it as just runs or production. So it's the improvement in their runs due solely to the flexibility of players on the roster. So Milwaukee, for example, at this end, is earning about 12% of its total production by doing nothing other than having a flexible team, players with a lot of flexibility. Okay? And you can tell there's a lot of variability across the league. How do I make these numbers more concrete? Well, let's look at the top 10. So these top 10 teams are earning between 1.5 to 2 runs on average because of flexibility alone, by doing nothing else. So if you think about it, at the end of the regular season, 1 to 2 runs is easily the difference between making and not making the playoffs. Okay. So this is the impact of flexibility at the team level. What about for the individual player? So we wanted to look at this concept. Is there a downside of flexibility for a player, for being what we quote say as a team player? So think about this as another example. Let's say you're trying to schedule a meeting with all of your friends. And you have this one friend who's very adamant, I can only meet at this one time. But you're very flexible, and you can meet at 5, 6, 7 times. What's going to happen? You're going to get your third or fourth choice, and your friend is going to get his first choice. Right? So you being flexible, you actually might suffer a little bit because of that. So do we have the same phenomenon in baseball? And it turns out the answer is yes. So this graph shows the impact of individual flexibility on the player on the x-axis and on the team on the y-axis. Every dot here is a player. And so the first thing you'll notice is that the y-axis is positive, which basically means flexibility is always good for the team. As a team, I would love to have flexible players. There's no downside to that. But what about for the individual players? It turns out there are people on this side of the axis. Right? So here's one that actually is very close to home, Jose Bautista. He plays for Toronto, as many of you know. So he is such a good player, and he plays so many different positions with skill that he is often called upon to fill in on another position. That's not his primary position. And the reason he's asked to fill in is because he's the team's next best option at that position. But unfortunately, he plays that position slightly worse than his primary position. And so because he's a team player, he's flexible, he swings over, he's actually costing himself a little bit of production, even though the team is gaining. So I've talked about decision models, and hopefully we can use these models to help guide real decision making. So what are some examples of decisions that you can make with these models? So the first would be roster construction. If I'm a general manager, I want to acquire free agents, or I want to make trades with another team, one thing I should consider is how flexible my existing players are, and whether or not this new player that I'm going to bring in is going to add to my network, or will it address a fragility in my network. In-game substitution. So I gave an example of Tampa Bay earlier, right? They used knowledge of their flexibility of their players to their advantage to make sure that people could swing around and chain this chain reaction throughout the field when one player got taken out of the game. Spring training opportunities is what we would call a situation where, let's say you can't acquire another player, but you look at the existing players on your team and you say, what player could I train a little bit more in perhaps a secondary position just to make our team a little bit more resilient to injury in that position? And what about finally for a player? If I'm a player or an agent who represents a player, if I understand very well my flexibility and the value that I add to my team, could I use that as ammunition when I go to renegotiate a new contract? So even though I've spent my time focusing on baseball, I don't want you to get the impression that baseball is where it's all at. Sports analytics is really everywhere these days, from tennis to soccer to baseball to hockey. There are people doing sports analytics in the academic research realm, all the way to the practitioner realm. There's papers on optimizing training for the decathlon. There's work that's being done in optimal curling strategy, and even to not real sports, but fantasy sports. There's work out there telling you how you can optimize your fantasy football team to beat all of your friends and hopefully make some money. Unfortunately, I haven't had much success in it myself so far, so maybe the jury's still out on whether or not it's valuable. So finally, I'd like to leave you with just a few takeaways. So the first is I'd like you to think broadly about sports analytics. So I talked about baseball, I talked about some statistics, but it's much more than that. It's using complex models. It's using non-traditional data, for example, real-time motion tracking data of players on the field. And it's really applied to all sports these days. Next, I'd like you to think deeply about sports. So especially for students in the audience who are interested in getting into this field, it's not enough to do basic number crunching these days. You need to arm yourself with advanced techniques if you really want to make an impact. Optimization, simulation, machine learning, statistics. And frankly, I think at the end of the day, better decision making, which is what we're aiming for, is possible when you combine the best of both. Thank you very much for your time.